Hello everyone, welcome to Sir Psych, and today I want to talk about the repressed function, the fourth function in the Carl Jung MBTI function stack. This is the function that is typically known for being the struggle area for every personality type. It could either be the thing that you struggle with the most, it's difficult for you to notice, it's kind of a blind spot. There's a lot of weaknesses associated with the repressed function because it's naturally the opposition to your first function. It's kind of the thing that you just really don't think about too often. But today I want to talk about how it's actually something that's very present in our life, especially if we don't pay attention to it, and what we can do to kind of mitigate the struggles associated with the repressed function. Let's get into it. So the first function is the function that we think of as often having the largest role in our personality, right? It's like the thing driving the ship of us. It's kind of our natural operating system, essentially. But what people tend to forget is that the repressed function actually plays just as large a role in your personality in the opposite direction. So if your dominant function is pulling entirely towards consciousness in a huge way, then your repressed function is pulling entirely towards unconsciousness in just the same way. This actually means that the repressed function plays more of a role in your psyche than the secondary and tertiary functions. And this means that the repressed function is essentially going to cause you more issues if you don't learn to manage it and if you don't pay attention to it. And that's really one of the core things that comes to mind when you have to think about how do I want to deal with the repressed function. The way that Carl Jung talks about it in Psychological Types is that you more so want to learn to manage it instead of trying to master it. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but I also want to talk about some of the other aspects related to this function because it's so important in the psyche. One thing that often gets brushed to the side when people are talking about the repressed function is actually the fact that it is often very aspirational for the individual. And what I mean by that is a lot of the times we know deep down and inherently that we're not the best at the things associated with this function, and we kind of secretly wish we could be. Say, for example, I'm an INTJ myself. I have always been hugely fascinated with martial arts. I think it's extremely fascinating. I've got some martial arts equipment around the house, and it's something I like to do in my spare time. But the difference is that for me, it's something that is more so aspirational than something that I think I could maintain as a constant habit or something that remained a living style throughout my life. And I don't think it would be healthy for me to attempt to get into it, at least in the same way that you might find an ESFP or an ESTP engaging in something related to martial arts. This is because the repressed function is aspirational. It is because we see that it's not something that maybe we're the best at, but it's a really huge part of our psyche. We recognize that extroverted sensing, or in my case as an INTJ, extroverted sensing is very important to me, but it's also something that I don't have a natural proclivity towards. It's not something that I'm going to be able to do without a lot of effort. And what you'll find is that effort starts to become really draining if you put in too much effort. And that's what Jung talked about in Psychological Types. Again, I've told the story with the banker a million times, where the INTP or ISTP was an introverted thinking dominant banker type, tries to be too friendly, tries to engage in extroverted feeling for too long, and then he kind of just blows up on his clients. And this is because you can't pretend to be someone you're not. You can't just be your shadow. It's not healthy to attempt to be your shadow. Now, you can do anything you want. There's activities that you can do that regardless of your function, you can find a way to do them, enjoy them. But when you try to engage in the type of mental processing associated with your repressed function for too long, it's going to end up putting you in a maybe unhealthy place, or it's going to put you in a stressed mind state. But what you'll find is that that's what makes our type so interesting, is because if you take, say, for example, an INTJ and put him into martial arts, for example, he won't do it in the same way that an ESFP will. He'll find an introverted intuition way to do that activity instead of trying to do it in the extroverted sensing way. And that's what's really interesting, in my opinion, about the dominant and repressed functions and these aspirations, is when you put people in their field that is oppositional to what is normal to them, and maybe there's someone who enjoys that, you're going to find that that's more of a rare case, but it can happen. Then you have these really drastic differences in viewpoints and new ways in which things can be thought about within that field. Last week I talked about jobs and occupation related to types, and I mentioned that somewhere in the world there's probably an ESTP who loves being, like a therapist or something. And it's people like this who come into these fields and actually enjoy it, and they're naturally drawn towards these things, but not in a way that's going to be pulling from their shadow. They're going to be the ones who bring large amounts of innovation to the world within those specific fields because they bring their own unique cognitive function, mindset to them. What I'm essentially getting at here is that the repressed function does not limit you in the things that you can do, it limits you in the ways in which you can do them. For example, let's go back to maybe martial arts, or let's say boxing, for example. I think I may have used this example before. If you take an INTJ boxer and an ESFP boxer and you put them in a ring together, their mental processes are not going to work the same. The extroverted sensing dominant type is going to be very reflexive. They're going to be interactive with the moment. They're going to be looking at the opponent's, fists and legs, trying to react. Whereas with the INTJ, you might find more of an NI approach where it's more predictive in nature. It's trying to kind of understand and recognize the patterns of the opponent's attacks, then try to pre-react to what they might want to be doing next. That's more of the introverted intuition approach. Both of them can do these things, but they're not going to be able to do it in the way of their opposite function. If you asked the ESFP, don't try to react to the opponent, try to predict them. The ESFP might be able to do that for a little bit, but it's going to be stressful. It's going to pull on that repressed introverted intuition. It's just going to be like, no, this isn't my natural way of trying to do this. It's stressful for me to try and attempt to do this through that function. Just as if you went to the INTJ and you said, hey, I need you to try not to predict, try to react to the opponent. And you're going to find that that's going to be more difficult for them because they can't engage in that extroverted sensing, more reactive and immediate functioning in the same way that the ESFP could. But each of them can do it in their own way, and it's different from the other. And that's really what I want to make sure is clear here with this repressed function video, is that your functions don't determine the things you can and cannot do. They simply determine the way in which you go about doing them, how you think about and how you process the information associated with the interest that you have. So don't let anyone tell you that just because you have X and X function or you are X and X type that you can't be interested or aspirational towards certain things. Just try to remember that your ways might be different from the ways that people typically do them within that field. I want to talk about the stress aspect of the aspirational side of things before I wrap up. So the stress in our repressed function comes when we try to do these things through that function, as I was talking about earlier, instead of maybe trying to find our own interesting way to do them. When we think about being aspirational towards certain activities, tasks, life goals, whatever, we often think about doing them in the way that someone of the opposite type to us would do it. So again, with the martial artist, for example, the INTJ is often aspirational towards how an ESFP might engage in that action instead of how they as an INTJ could do it. Because to them, it's like, wow, look at the reactiveness they have. Look at the abilities that he or she has that I as an individual don't, but I feel like somewhere deep inside of me, I could do this. The reality is that, yeah, maybe you could do it, but it's not going to be sustainable. And again, that's the point with the repressed function, is it's something that's not typically sustainable because it's the opposite of your dominant function. The thing that guides your entire life, pretty much, the way in which you normally think, it is the opposite of that. And that's why it's so difficult when we try to engage in this process, because it's like you're going from a fully matured, grown adult who's been living a long time to a essentially baby who has no idea what it's doing and has no ability to understand, and it's going to get frustrated really easily, and it can't take care of itself. That's the difference between the dominant and the repressed function in most individuals, even younger individuals. The dominant function develops relatively fast throughout the lifespan. By the time you're 18, you've pretty much got a good handle on the dominant function alone, and then you're going to start going into that auxiliary function. But your repressed function is something that, like, you never really master. Maybe if humans lived for 200 years, or maybe if you're like the most wise person on the planet, and you've lived so much and you've had tons of experience and you've deeply reflected on all of these experiences, maybe you could get a grip on that repressed function in a realistic way. But even then, I don't think it works like that, because your dominant function inherently comes at the expense of your repressed function's way of processing information. So you can't ever really master this, because you can't really just switch to just practice taking in extroverted sensing if you're an INTJ or an INFJ for long periods of time. So in reality, the repressed function is just the way in which you don't process information, because your dominant function is the way in which you do process information. So you're going to be really stressed if you can't learn to take in information in the way that is natural to you, while also being aware of the information that you might be missing because of your repressed function. And this is why it's a great idea to maybe have friends who are of the type that are opposite to you, because you can ask them their opinion on these topics. Hey, I know you're an ESFP. I really might be missing something common here, something that really might be obvious to you. Do you have any opinions or thoughts? These are great questions to ask people who are of the opposite types to you, especially if you're going to be working on something or working on a hobby interest that's really important to you. All right, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on the repressed function. The repressed function is the one, of course, that I think is really interesting when it comes to learning about personality type, because it's the one that takes the most effort to manage, really. You have to put in a lot of effort and thought into, okay, how can I be a better person because of my repressed function? What am I missing here? How can I not let this function take over my life and guide me into a dark place? And once you really get a grip on the repressed function, then you really start to see things turn around. And I really think it's important for people to be aware of the negative things that come with their repressed function. Again, don't try to master, don't try to be someone that you're not, but be aware of your repressed function and what are the negative things that come from maybe you being ignorant to it. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. I would like to remind everybody that I do have personality typing sessions available at my website, asurasec.com, if you're interested in working with me to find out what your personality type is and what that means for you. This has been Asura from Asurasec. Have a good one.